Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee. It's been a week that's seen a deal finally agreed for a ceasefire in Gaza after 15 months of war. A three-phase deal that should see the release of hostages in exchange for hundreds of prisoners. It's due to start on Sunday, a version of the same deal first put on the table last May. The US President-elect claiming credit for pushing it over the line. If it does go ahead, well, this is a plan aiming for more than a truce, but not for peace. Instead, these are, quote, steps to sustainable calm.
Our prayer was answered. I was so happy. We just want to live like normal people.
I welcome this deal with a joy in my heart for every hostage saved, for every file saved.
It's been a week that's seen the dramatic arrest of South Korea's already impeached and suspended president, Yoon Suk-yeol. 3,000 armed police used bolt cutters to wade through barbed wire and scale barricades to get to him as he hid in his compound. It was a second attempt to do so for alleged insurrection after his failed bid to impose martial law back in December. In a letter released to the public, he says he doesn't recognise the authority of the warrant and then gave this video address.
I decided to respond to the Corruption Investigation Office for high-ranking officials, despite it being an illegal investigation, to prevent unsavory bloodshed.
And it's been a good week for the Chinese app Red Note, with a surge of Americans signing up, calling themselves the TikTok Refugee Club, driven away by fears that time could soon be up across the US for TikTok over its alleged national security threat. The Supreme Court upholding the ruling. The message, sell up or you'll be shut up by Sunday. But, like its namesake crocodile in Peter Pan, the app has become something of an anti-hero to many, with some senior Democrats that originally called for an outright ban now wanting it to be saved.
We aren't against TikTok. We want TikTok to keep going. But we are against a Chinese company that is in cahoots with the Chinese Communist Party owning TikTok.
Well, alongside me in the studio tonight, Agnès Poirier, journalist and author of Left Bank and Notre Dame, the Soul of France. Agnès, great to see you.
Thank you.
I heard a brilliant podcast that you did recently for the BBC, The Rebuilding of Notre Dame, an insider's guide to the cathedral. Beautiful.
Thank you.
I just want to know now, are there still lines, if you go and look outside Notre Dame, stretching around the corner for a chance to see inside?
Well, it's very strange. Yes, there are lines because, as you know, you can book in advance to go in and therefore to avoid the queues, especially by, Arctic weather conditions. But if you go very early, I was there yesterday, and the queue without booking, without reservation, was actually quicker than the people who had booked. So you can always, try your luck.
I hadn't yet, but now you've said that, there's an insider's tip. Thank you, Agnès. Let's bring in Richard Worley, Europe correspondent and columnist for Swiss-German publisher Blick, author of The Ball of Illusions, What France Believes and What the World Sees. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Right, talk us through what you've been focusing on this week.
Well, on two things. On the one hand, Gaza, because I had to write about it and to see whether the ceasefire can hold or not and what Mr. Trump intends to do with Gaza. But the second story, obviously, was France and Mr. Bayrou, who, step by step, is becoming the savior of the country.
You're right. Well,
I wouldn't go that far.
Yes.
Me neither.
The fact that he's survived is a good thing. The fact that he's lasted a month in comparison is a good thing.
And you see, the way I put it, I triggered a debate.
That's why you're much loved on this programme, amongst our viewers too. Richard, great to have you with us. Let's bring in Dalal Mawad, Paris-based correspondent for Al Arabi TV, author of All She Lost, a chronicle of Lebanon's collapse, the port explosion of 2020. Dalal, tell us about your week.
Well, I've been focused on the French government as well and the survival of François Bayrou, but also keeping an eye on French diplomacy in Lebanon and this new era that's been ushered with the election of a new president and the nomination of a prime minister. Reformist duo, I would say. It looks promising. We have to wait and see how it looks like. What
do you make of President Macron's trip there this week?
Well, I think he's trying to consolidate, the efforts, the diplomatic efforts of France in Lebanon, starting with the ceasefire, but also with the election of a president. France has special ties, historical ties with Lebanon. And I think he was also there to make sure a government sees the light soon, because there were some issues with Hezbollah's participation to the government. They did not attend the consultations with the prime minister. But I also want to say that it's looking more hopeful.
Dela, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And let's go to the UK. Let's bring in Judah Grunstein, Editor-in-Chief of World Politics Review. Judah, what has gripped you or caught you by surprise this week?
Caught me by surprise. I can't really say. What we've been looking at is obviously the imminent return of Donald Trump to the White House. And then later this week, clearly the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
Great to have you on side as well, Judah. Judah Grunstein, who is in Newcastle in the UK. Well, if a path to a truce is complicated, the path to start a truce is not straightforward either. The Israeli cabinet has to give final approval to the agreed deal, the one that was delayed this week until today, Friday, accusing Hamas of seeking last-minute changes. Still, it went ahead, and, well, it's gone through the security cabinet. It's got to go through the general cabinet as we speak. It may happen during this programme. But assuming it goes ahead, the signs are good so far. It's been 468 days since the Hamas massacres across the border towns of Israel, with 1,200 people killed, around 250 hostages taken. The war since reshaped the Middle East, more than 40,000 people killed in Gaza, 2 million displaced, many over and over again trying to survive bomb attacks and the ever-looming threat of famine. I want to start with Delal. Your first thought when the news came through that there had been a deal agreed from Qatar, what or who did you think of first?
I thought of the Palestinians in Gaza. The sense of relief. We saw some of these videos, people, crying and cheering and dancing. Although when you come to think about it, and as you rightly said, this is not peace. This is a temporary truth, and we don't even know if it's going to hold. And Gavin, I know it gives a sense of relief, but I think, the biggest challenge on the long run is addressing the core issue of this conflict. Tomorrow the war will end. We know it will eventually end one way or another, but occupation is still there. Occupation, Israeli occupation of Palestinian land remains. The apartheid state is still there. The oppression of the Palestinians is still there. And so unless the root cause of the problem is addressed and we can talk about justice and a Palestinian statehood, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. History is just going to keep repeating itself. And of course, there's a sense of relief also and thoughts with the families of the hostages who've been, pressuring the government and Netanyahu. And, this deal could have been endorsed earlier. Lives could have been saved, including hostages. And here we are, all of a sudden, it's possible. And I think I'm someone who believes that, yes, this was the Biden's proposal, put in place in May, but I also believe in the Trump effect. And I think the former administration, the one that's leaving, did not put enough pressure on Israel, whereas Trump did. There might have been some concessions, and that worries me when it comes to settlements, when it comes to maybe potentially something with Iran or normalization with the Arab countries. Definitely, it wasn't a unilateral pressure on both sides. But it's good that the deal is here, but I think there are a lot of challenges. I think phase one will be easier. I don't know if we're going to go into details. I'm worried about phase two. That's when we are going to be talking about the full Israeli withdrawal. And we've seen the ceasefire in Lebanon. It's been violated again and again by Israel with airstrikes. And to this day, the ceasefire in Lebanon is about to, the 60 days period is about to end, and there's still no complete withdrawal of Israeli troops. And the French president mentioned this today and said, it applies to both sides, but the Israelis need to withdraw as well. So I think, the second phase is worrisome, and there are a lot of questions on the long run. Who's gonna govern Gaza? Is Israel going to accept, the Palestinian Authority coming back? Do the Palestinians want the Palestinian Authority to come back? And Gaza itself is, yes, today there's a sense of relief, but to give you a few numbers, 6% of the entire Gaza population has been wiped out by Israel. 88% of schools destroyed. 90% of people were displaced. 60%, that's the latest figure, of buildings were destroyed. And just today, the AP issued a report talking about Israel starting a buffer zone, although there's no international endorsement of that, a 60-kilometer buffer zone on the border. So a lot of question marks on, whether Israel is going to hold, its commitment. I think Hamas would, because it wanted this ceasefire deal for a while. But I don't know if Israel is going to stick, especially with the pressure from Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the extreme right ministers, who now are kind of like, backtracked a bit. Ben Gvir didn't resign. So that makes me wonder, does that mean maybe we're going to do phase one, release hostages, as many as we can, but then at a later stage, we're coming back to the war because Israel has been talking about a total victory, Gavin?
Well, it takes us to, there's a number of issues you raise. One is this buffer zone, which I think that will be a clear concern for those in Gaza and for the US administration as well. Depends, because we're also hearing mixed views from the US administration about whether or not they would be supportive if Israel in the occupied West Bank, for example, in different parts. It's very hard to try and second-guess the Trump administration right now. But here's the other thing to raise with you, Agnes. We heard this week from Antony Blinken, outgoing Secretary of State, saying the number of recruits for Hamas in Gaza is almost that of those who've been killed since the war began. And the answer is, therefore, how to fill the vacuum, because if there's nothing else, it will only continue to be the same cycle.
Yes, and you mentioned the Palestinian Authority. I mean, I'm not even sure the Palestinians want it back.
Exactly.
Look, there's a Trump effect to that ceasefire, because in details, it's exactly the same agreement that the Biden administration proposed to both parties in May and then again in July. So at least, we have to rejoice that this is the beginning of the end of a nightmare for the civilians on both sides, because the hostages must be back home, whether they are still alive or dead. There are 3 stages, so I'm quite confident we'll get the first stage, but it could collapse at any point. There's the Philadelphia corridors. There are many other questions. But what is interesting is, because Trump is not a diplomat, but let's call it Trump's diplomacy. It's as unpredictable as it is transactional. So what will be the future transactions? Because, Netanyahu wants to give that present, just before his inauguration on Monday. So he, I think, expects something back from it. What will it be? Will it be with the settlers? We don't know. There are so many steps before we get even to the root causes of what is in effect. It's been the longest, the deadliest episode in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it will take years to rebuild. And this is where Europe which has been really absent from the whole thing, can actually play a part. We have noticed that Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, really applied pressure. Again, he's a property tycoon. He's not a diplomat. But perhaps this is what was required. No diplomacy, but sort of some brutality applied on both Hamas and Netanyahu.
Which is a very good point to raise, actually, Agnes. Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, property developer for Trump, who apparently went into this meeting. As part of the meetings, he wanted to see Benjamin Netanyahu this week. He was told he can't, it's the Sabbath. And he was told, I don't care if it's the expletive Sabbath, get in the room this morning. If that's true, he was in the room, he met him. It's a very different approach. So, what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, Trump had quite an easy task, because the plan, as it was said, the plan was there. The plan was drawn by the Biden administration for months, and both parties, Hamas, Israel, but also Qatar, they knew all details of that plan. So what was needed is a pressure, and that's what you said. Steve Witkoff applied a pressure. Now, what's going to happen? I just want to draw two lessons. First of all, we saw those images of the Gaza population. And you said about Hamas, the number of fighters that are enrolling for Hamas. Clearly, I mean, the Palestinian people are expressing their willingness to stay, to have a state, and to defend themselves. I think that's important because keep in mind that in Trump administration and in Trump entourage, a number of people would like to see the Palestinians leave Gaza, go somewhere else, in Egypt, in Jordan. The message that I'm seeing is that despite the ruins, despite the war, despite the atrocities, they want Gaza to remain their land. And that's a very powerful message. Then the second message I draw is the hostages. Netanyahu has for months decided to forget the Israeli hostage and to continue his war. Now some of them are going to be freed, bodies are going to be recovered, but don't forget who is responsible for having left these hostages into the hands of Hamas, and that's Netanyahu. So that's the true lesson I would like to draw from what just happened.
Judah, just listening to Richard, I want to also draw in some good news in a story which has just been non-stop, yet horror, upset and heartache for 15 months now. We're still waiting. It may happen during our programme for the absolute confirmation from the Israeli cabinet that this is going to go ahead on Sunday. But this was the moment it was announced by the Qatari Prime Minister. And also let's have a look at some of the images on the streets of Israel and in the rubble and the ruin of Gaza that night as well. Let's take a look.
The state of Qatar, the Arab Republic of Egypt and the United States of America are pleased to announce the success of joint mediation efforts, resulting in an agreement between the parties to the conflict in the Gaza Strip regarding the exchange of prisoners and hostages, the return to sustained calm, and ultimately achieving a permanent ceasefire between the two sides. With both sides and the negotiating parties having approved this agreement, work is underway to finalise all implementation procedures tonight. Subsequently, the necessary internal procedures will be undertaken by the Israeli government, after which the agreement is set to be implemented on Sunday, January the 19th.
Let's take a look at some of those street scenes I was talking about. So this was the response on the streets in Israel and in Gaza shortly after. I think we can bring you that. Are we having problems with the gallery? Judah, let me come to you, because here we can see them now. Judah, let me raise this to you as well. Benjamin Netanyahu has brought up a number of times that, he's a big factor in why this deal hasn't happened, because this isn't just about the deal for Gaza, it's about his own existential situation of what happens to him politically. And there is talk that the reason we haven't had any idea of a plan for Gaza is that he doesn't know how to make a decision which would upset one side and hasten his own downfall. That was the words of his own former biographer, who said actually he just doesn't want to do anything that would hasten the speed that he goes. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I think that everyone did a really great job of assessing and analyzing the state on the ground, the ceasefire, the challenges and the problems. I think that when it comes to Netanyahu, or rather, I think there's a mistake in the focus on Netanyahu individually with regard to the resistance to a Palestinian state, and with regard to the sort of divisions in Israel with regard to the war. The divisions in Israel with regard to the war had to do with whether to put getting the hostages back first and prioritize that before essentially punishing the Palestinians in Gaza for October 7th. And so I think that, yes, Netanyahu does have his existential political concerns about ending the war because it seems like he might not survive politically once the war is over. But that said, that doesn't mean that there's some sort of groundswell of support within Israel for a Palestinian state. That's simply not the case. And I think that has to be confronted head on. I think that with regard to a ceasefire, to the ceasefire, it's really important to remember that a ceasefire is better than no ceasefire. With regard to the suffering in Gaza, as well as the families of the hostages in Israel, which even if the numbers are disproportionate, we can measure deaths, we can't really measure trauma. And so I think it's important to remember that a ceasefire is better than no ceasefire. I think everyone's been a little too kind to Trump with regard to the impact he played or the role he played. Certainly that was one of the factors. There were other internal and external factors within Israel, Netanyahu picking up a handful of seats in his coalition recently, which kind of inoculated him against the potential defection of some of the far right. Within Hamas, the death of Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Daif, I think played a role. The broader regional picture certainly played a role for Hamas in terms of the weakening of Hezbollah and Iran and its regional supports.
Yes, but Judah, there's two things here you've missed out. One, that he talked about annihilation of Hamas, which he hasn't achieved. Two, it's very easy to say you're overstating the role of Benjamin Netanyahu when this is the person who triggered the conflict in the first place and was part of its continuation, had a big decision unto whether or not to end it, to which, has issues of an international criminal court warrant for arrest, which he denies. And there are big implications for him when he leaves office legally as well. So these all come into the pot, don't they? And what's your take on this, Dalal, as well, after Judah, that ultimately what happens to him appears to be, even those around him say, part of his decision-making?
Absolutely. I'm not saying that Netanyahu didn't play a role, or even that Trump didn't play a role in finally pushing the ceasefire over the line. Excuse me. But Netanyahu hasn't been the only one who's insisted on continuing the war in Israel. Yoav Gallant was pretty adamant about continuing, and many others. There's been a division within Israel in terms of public opinion. So it's not that I'm saying that neither played a role. I'm just saying that there were other factors as well that changed things. And I think fundamentally, when it comes to a war that has not resulted in either annihilation or unconditional surrender, the two sides stop fighting when they both consider that they can't gain anything more from continuing the fighting. And I think that's pretty clear to everyone, all outside observers, that's the case here. The problem, though, in terms of moving from a ceasefire to a cessation of hostilities and then beyond that, a peaceful coexistence, is that it's a question of a chicken and egg problem. You have all these little details that are extremely difficult to work out, and they only really can be resolved or sort of seen in perspective when there's a fundamental trust or desire for peace.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that fundamental trust and desire for peace can't really happen until all these baby steps and little details get worked out, which is why they call them trust-building measures, to show both sides that they can begin to let their guard down. So it's a very difficult time right now. I'm not convinced, I think Dalal said it, that Netanyahu or the Israeli security establishment is very committed to extending it into the second phase of a full withdrawal and then a cessation of hostilities. So
okay, no, Judah, I get your
it's very
I get your
tentative
point.
still.
Okay, Dalal, briefly.
No, I agree with what Judah said. And I think the problem is Netanyahu is part of the problem. He's the biggest problem, probably. But I think there's an enabling political environment in Israel with the rise of the far right, which is unprecedented also when, we look at everything that's ongoing. But I think it doesn't pin down to Netanyahu. I think the problem with the Palestinians is an institutional and a structural one. Netanyahu might leave. There won't be necessarily peace in a Palestinian state. We know Netanyahu never believed in a two-state solution. That we can agree on, and everyone admits that. But if he leaves, are things going to look better? I'm not sure, because it's really structural and institutional. It's been there for decades, denying the Palestinians a state that should be rightfully theirs. And I think the idea of annihilating Hamas, they tried with the PLO, right? They weakened the PLO and then Hamas was born. They'll try with Hamas now. I also think the idea of resistance cannot be pinned down to one movement or one person or one group. The Palestinians will continue to resist as long as there is occupation. So maybe another movement will see the light, even more radical. And who wants a more radical movement, right? So again, I go back to what I said initially. Unless we address the root cause of the problem, and let's stop saying, oh, that's on the long run, it's difficult. It's not difficult. It's not as complex as the Western media wants to say it is. It's a case of occupation. Occupation needs to end, and then, everyone can live in peace and Israel can be safe, but it cannot be safe if this keeps, happening. Violence will keep happening again and again, Gavin.
Della, thank you. We'll see. I mean, we are still waiting for confirmation. As I say, it may come this evening, but we are looking still Sunday, the day of the commencement of the ceasefire. Well, hours after the announcement of a truce deal being made by negotiators in Gaza, 11,000 kilometres from Doha, where it was made this week, in Washington, 8 o'clock in the evening, President Biden sat down at the Oval Office desk and delivered his final address to the nation, drawing on inspiration of the French gift to the US, the Statue of Liberty, how it appears, he said, forever in motion, always staying above water, whatever storms come and go. The 46th president may well be remembered as the one who didn't know when to go, when to pass the torch. His parting shot was his fear of what's to come.
Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms. I'm equally concerned about the potential rise of a tech-industrial complex that could pose real dangers for our country as well. Americans are being buried under an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation, enabling the abuse of power. The free press is crumbling. Editors are disappearing. Social media is giving up on fact-checking. The truth is smothered by lies told for power and for profit.
And yes, an oligarchy, Trump and co. Has he got a point?
He's got a real point. I mean, it's difficult not to share his anxiety. It's only, in 3 days' time that Trump is going to be inaugurated, and actually his second mandate is going to be very different from the first one. And we already feel that, that blast in Europe with Elon Musk. So the world's richest man, and it's going to go up and up, his fortune, because he's allied with somebody who serves his interest, his financial interests. And I don't think it's a question of convictions, it purely interests. And he's trying to meddle so much in UK politics. It's quite extraordinary. But of course, on the other hand, the European leaders are very good at talking, saying this is not acceptable. But really, when you look at the EU commissions and EU commissioners and the president, then they are, walking on eggshells. They don't want to be unfriendly to somebody who's so powerful. So yes, Joe Biden, we might remember his words, in the next few months and years. But it's words that Eisenhower actually said in 1961. So that gives a bit of perspective.
And yet, Richard, given what Anya said and given what we've heard from President Biden, you could say it's all very well, President Biden, giving that warning. Isn't it a bit late about social media now, like King Lear? Suddenly you see the folly around you when it's too late. He's had his time in office. Perhaps something could have been done earlier.
Great point. I think, unfortunately, Biden cannot be heard because precisely his administration has not done anything visible on what he describes. And moreover, his administration and the Democrat Party have relied on some of these oligarchs that are now turning their coat and going to knee in front of Donald Trump. I'm thinking of Jeff Bezos, I'm thinking of Zuckerberg. They were kind of pillar of the Democrat establishment. So sorry to say, but though what he described is a reality, I'm afraid he's not the right person to say so. And maybe, and that's the most terrible thing, because he says so, he gives an argument to Trump who say, you see, this guy is not serious. You can't talk about an oligarchy because it was existing before. So I believe we've got a problem with Musk. We've got a problem with those oligarchs. That is true. But the Democrat Party in the US has a real checkup to do on itself.
Judah, the last hours of President Biden, how do you think historians will judge him?
Well, pretty harshly, I think. I think there's a before and after, and I think the before is the first 2, maybe 3 years of his presidency, and the sense that there was something of a renewal and a restoration of American leadership with regard to Ukraine. In other parts of the world as well, an engagement, and importantly, I think also a restoration of protocol, of the way American diplomacy is usually conducted, and an engagement with multilateralism.
You're very interesting.
I think then we come to the last year of his presidency, and I think the Israel-Hamas war was very corrosive for his legacy, but I think as well this revelation that he had become really a shadow of himself, and the fact that it was kept from everyone when the big attack against Donald Trump was that he always lies. And so I think that as much as the Democratic Party managed the transition to Kamala Harris's candidacy very well under the circumstances, I think there was a very real sense of betrayal and a betrayed trust. And that once trust is broken, it's very hard to restore, obviously. And so I think that on a whole range of things, Biden pursued policies and got them and implemented them that were very progressive and very effective. And at the same time, they're across an equal range. We can look at failures or unkept promises or shortcomings. But I think really it comes down to this last year of real disappointment. If I could just say one last thing, just hearing that clip from his speech, my first thought was this sounds like American Carnage, which was Trump's inauguration speech 8 years ago. And the beginning of Biden's presidency was all about America is back, American renewal. It was the antithesis of American Carnage. It was a real message of hope in the idea of America and American values and what America represents in the world. That speech was a lot darker in ways that I do think reflect where we are currently.
Well, we will see what America represents in the world. We'll also see what represents America in the world, because it's been this nomination week. We've seen the defence pick Pete Hegseth, the military veteran Fox News host. He's been questioned heavily. A lot of people saying he's not up to the job. He only ever managed 8 people. Said that's not even a middle management level. He said there were volunteers as well. Agnès, briefly, what have you made of nomination week and those who could be up for big jobs?
Well, it's bewildering. I mean, it's difficult to think that this is real and this is happening, but it is. It is, and we've been there before. It's just more of what we knew during his first mandate. So now we should not just be bewildered, but accept it and try to see how to counteract it. Well, thank God we're not Americans. At least we are not.
No, and not everyone is miserable.
But they are going to be. Most of them are going to be chosen and pass the test and be picked. So like Steve Witkoff, who he's a property tycoon. He can recognize what is a good buy and a good sell, but he's no diplomat. But he's here.
Sometimes maybe you need to go in with a hammer and a pen, and somebody else holds the pen, he holds the hammer.
We have to deal with those people. It's about transactions. So we need to actually change probably our software ourselves and just not look bewildered or even furious. This is happening. We have to deal with it.
Briefly,
nothing, just to add that I personally believe that politics is always about transactions. But Trump is so open about it because he's a businessman, right? And I disagree that it's true we're not American, but I think America's choice affects everyone. We've seen this throughout history. And just to give you an example, for example, the U.S. ambassador to Jerusalem, it's so bleak for the Palestinians. That's someone who does not believe the West Bank even exists. He talks about Judea and Samaria. So this is just to give you an example of the kind of people that are going to be around Trump. And that's very worrisome.
And the father-in-law of, it's the father, in fact, of his son-in-law, isn't it? That's going to be the new ambassador to France, who's not been, fresh out of prison relatively
recently. A lot of
recently.
family appointments as well,
yes.
very Trump.
We will, right. Some good news, though. I quote that the ex-Brazil President Jair Bolsonaro has said this week he's excited, telling reporters he's so fired up he doesn't have to take Viagra anymore. So, anyway, to take us nicely to the next issue of social media, a man that uses it all the time, Jair Bolsonaro, to Donald Trump as well, and the issue of TikTok in the US. National security concerns around China's influence on the app. In theory, the ban comes into place Sunday. The owner, ByteDance, faces an ultimatum to sell up. A non-Chinese buyer has to come in, or time's up. However, we've heard the US Supreme Court has been in the process of considering an appeal against it. It did consider it and it upheld the ban on security concerns. Meanwhile, while we wait to see what happens, the White House has said this will be on Trump's territory, therefore he has to implement it. He has said he will decide what to do about the ban. So there's a bit of a legal question at the moment. Meanwhile, other Chinese apps are doing well in the uncertainty. Number one in the App Store, 3 days in a row this week in the US. RedNote said to have similar functionality. This is Marcus Robinson, a fashion designer, and one of the scores of new joiners describing themselves as TikTok refugees.
I've been using TikTok since around 2020. But to find out that TikTok will be banned in the US, I was kind of upset. So immediately I wanted to download the app and get ahead of the curve. I've probably had the app for about 36 hours now, and it's already at 10,000 followers, which is insane to me.
So the terms and conditions on RedNote is worth saying it's all still in Mandarin. So there's either a surprising number of Mandarin speakers or people are ticking that box blind. RedNote faces the same US regulatory pressures as TikTok. There's another popular app, Lemonade, but to misquote the famous advice, if life hands you lemonade, check who's made it. I've checked, it's ByteDance, same owner behind TikTok. Let's go to you, Richard, first of all. Is it a news resource to you? Are you on TikTok? And is it a security threat?
OK, I'm not on TikTok. Bleak, the newspaper I work for, is on TikTok. And yes, it is a real security concern. It's a real security concern, and in a way the US is addressing it the way we should address it in Europe regarding Mr. Musk and X, for example. So I do not know how this will end, because we understand that Trump is so happy to have a leverage, and he's going to negotiate that with China. He already said that he mentioned TikTok during the phone conversation he had with President Xi Jinping. So it gives him a leverage. But the reality is our countries, whenever we realize that those applications owned by foreign countries are so, I would say, massively popular and represent a potential danger, we should address it. I don't say we should ban it, but we should address it one way or another. So I believe the US system is working in the case of TikTok, but it's not working against the American oligarchy.
And yet it doesn't sound like, as of Sunday into Monday, the lights are going to go out, does it? Suddenly you won't be able to use the app. Given what the White House has said, Donald Trump saying he's studying this, where do you see this going?
Well, he's changed opinion on TikTok. He wanted it banned, I think, in 2020. Now, I think he's quite happy. He said in the name of free speech.
Well, no, he was quite transparent as well, didn't he? Say that I've got more than a million followers.
Yeah, he profited.
It's useful to me.
Yes, completely. And so he could always have an executive order. I mean, we'll see next week. It's also, as Richard said, it offers him some leverage with China. But there will be, it will be chaotic because a lot of people don't know what to do. And not only people on TikTok looking at Red Note, which actually is the Little Red Book, is the literal translation from the Mandarin. I would be quite wary of going on the Little Red Book social media. But advertising revenues. I mean, look at Mark Zuckerberg, look at Meta, look at YouTube. They are the two ones who will benefit the most from a ban of TikTok. And they've already prepared for an influx and to handle the traffic should TikTok be banned, because then, they will inherit a lot of followers. They've already also tried to emulate TikTok with short-form videos.
Yes.
So a lot of other social media will be more like TikTok than they used to be, just in the hope that should it be banned, they will get some of it.
This is useful to you, Dalal, TikTok, and do your work in the Middle East?
I think TikTok is very big in the Middle East. I have an account, but I think TikTok belongs to the younger ones, the Generation Z. I'm not. I'm an Instagram generation, I would say. TikTok is very big in the Middle East. Just to give you an idea, there was a study in July of last year that said the highest reach of TikTok is in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And what happened the past year is because of Meta's behavior on Instagram and on Facebook, shadow banning accounts that were sharing content on Palestinians and Gaza. My personal account was shadow banned. I had posts removed. So because of that, we've also witnessed a lot of Arabs shifting to TikTok and using TikTok more, including Palestinian content producers. And I would say in general, I agree with both, but I think if we want to regulate or ban, I think all of these platforms have been used as propaganda tools by various entities in various countries. That would include Facebook and the Meta entity as well. So I would be very wary of these algorithms and how they've been used. But TikTok specifically is very dangerous, and it's been used by extremist groups, including the Russians, for example, to spread fake news and propaganda. And so they need to be regulated. But I think banning goes... We're still, manipulating and experiencing with these platforms. I'm against the ban. I'm definitely against it. I don't think it's what we should be doing here.
Judah, we have final word to you. We have 30 seconds. Della said she would be against the ban. If you had to choose, where would you sit on this?
Well, I just want to point out that there is an American on the panel tonight with regard to Trump. With regard to TikTok, I'm not a user. I think my eldest son would die of embarrassment if I did have an account. There are national security aspects. There are free speech aspects. It's a very difficult balance to strike. I think the bigger issue, and it ties in with the oligarchy, is that I think that we're moving into an era when social media platforms will be seen as official or unofficial arms of the state. TikTok is seen that way with the CCP. We know that Musk is soon to be an unofficial or unpaid government representative in the United States. X and Twitter have interfered with European politics already. Zuckerberg has bowed at the knee to Trump as well. and has asked for protection from the US government. So I think that what began 10 years ago as this global commons or the global public square, I think that era is very clearly over. And what we're looking at is a period when data will be sequestered and fragmented and kept within national borders, and social media will become almost an unofficial offensive arm of the state to influence opinion abroad and possibly even create trouble, like what happened here in the UK with the violence against refugees.
Judah, good to talk to you.
I think it is a darker
you're going to crash the
up.
programme otherwise, Judah, but it's great to have your final thought, a potential tool, offence to the state. Judah Greenstein, thank you. Also on the panel, author and journalist Agnès Poirier, Richard Verley, correspondent at Blick, Dalal Mawad, correspondent at Al Arabi TV. Join us in 7 days. We'll be back for The World next week.